my agenda really quickly of what I want to talk about today, will which will really focus on how I got into research first and foremost, and sort of circle back to how the research that I do is in the Migration Identity and Education Lab is related to some of the my story. And then I'll talk a little bit about what it's like to be a person in our lab and some of our current research. And then we'll hopefully have time to talk. Okay, I'll answer any of your questions. Okay. All right. So I actually am a first generation college student, and I'm also a 1.5 generation immigrant. And so as a 1.5 generation immigrant and one of the first people in my family to go to college, I became really interested in researching how immigrant youth, and in particular minoritized youth, negotiate their identities. I started this while I was an undergrad in where I majored in psychology and comparative studies and race and ethnicity, which is the equivalent of what we have here as CRES, critical race and ethnic studies. So I was a double major. And then I also received my master's in social psychology and then my PhD in developmental sciences. So I'm very much trained in across various disciplines. So my research is extremely interdisciplinary, very non-traditional in terms of psychology. Initially took a course on immigrant psychology, and I realized that I was interested in the experiences that my family and I had had when we moved to the United States, in particular the gendered experiences that we had, where my sister and I were able to go to college and graduate from college, and my brother was not, and he ended up in the school to prison pipeline. And so that's where I found that there were actual people in academia that were doing research that was similar to that interested me, because I wanted to understand what was happening with my family and with our own experiences in the United States. And so that person who you see in this slide that's hooding me, so when you get your PhD, you get your hood put on you and back. That's Dr. Padilla, and he's the one that I took the class from. Anyway, so fast forward a bunch of years, and after going through more training as a postdoctoral researcher, so after my doctorate at NYU, I ended up becoming an assistant professor at the School of Transporter Studies, which is the equivalent of the Latino Studies Department at Arizona State University. And then ultimately the goal was to come back to California. I was raised, and so I am very happy to be at UC Santa Cruz, closer to my family, and also doing the research that I want to do, and with amazing collaborators, both in the community and undergraduate and graduate students. So before I get started in terms of what the Migration Identity and Education Lab does, I just want to contextualize where we're at UC Santa Cruz. UC Santa Cruz is a Research One university, which means it engages in the highest levels of research activity in terms of how they rank institutions of higher education. And so there's a lot of doctoral students. A lot of you have, for example, doctoral students as your teaching assistants, as your graduate student course instructors. And so you have access as undergraduates to research that some other undergrads in other universities that aren't research universities don't have. So even if you're not really thinking about going into a research program or a graduate school program that focuses on research, I think it's, I would be remiss to not tell you that you have an excellent opportunity to engage in research experience. In particular, too, our university is a Hispanic serving institution, meaning that we have more than 25%, a little bit higher than 25% Latina students. And it's a minority serving institution too, because we also are serving Asian American and Pacific Islander students at a higher rate. And so it's really unique in the sense that it's both a minority serving institution and a research institution. And so I would definitely recommend that at some point in your career here, you engage in some research activity and try to see if you like it. And if not, you get a lot of tools that you can use in other industries in terms of organization, analytics, and whatnot. So I would just wanted to highlight that context of where we're at UC Santa Cruz in terms of research. And in our lab and in my personal research agenda as a researcher, my own scholarship is consistently informed by both my teaching, my community involvement, and my mentoring, which involves obviously undergraduate students, graduate students, and even postdoctoral fellows. And within the lab, I actively engage at all these intergenerational researchers to apply our work to understand the educational needs of immigrant origin and Latina youth, and and adaptation. And ultimately, we really try to promote equity, psychological well-being, and social justice for Latina, for students of color, for immigrant students within their different educational and community systems. So as you can see in this image here of a child, this is the Brenner model of development, ecological model, which basically in essence is just stating that we develop across different microsystem, which are direct interactions that we have on a day-to-day basis, whether it's with family, teachers, other people in our lives, right? And then there's the mesosystem, which is the interactions that are people we're interacting with each other. So like a parent's interaction with the teacher impacts the person, the youth in the middle. And then the exosystem is really those not so much tangible lived experiences on a day-to-day basis, but systems that ultimately impact the development of youth. So policies and different practices that schools have in particular, because that's my focus, education. And so the exosystem is maybe not as clear in terms of example, at a school in Arizona where I conducted research, they had an English only policy where students weren't allowed to speak Spanish in their classrooms. And the students that I was conducting research with and their families were impacted on a day-to-day basis because of that policy. So that would be the exosystem. That's the policy that's impacting them on a day-to-day basis. And then of course the macro system, which is more so the blueprint of how we conduct ourselves in society, right? Meaning our different beliefs, our cultural values, our political philosophies and ideologies. Within psychology, and in particular in social psychology, we really, I'm interested in how we develop our beliefs and our assumptions about people. So stereotypes about people, stigmatization about particular students, and that would factor into the macro system. So really all this comes together because I want to identify ways that we can disrupt particular systems that create inequitable pathways through schooling of, again, primarily in immigrant origin, Latina, and other students of color. And so a lot of my heavily in the research that I do, I heavily apply it to my teaching for empowering students of color, for mentoring undergraduate, graduate, and graduate students, and to really engage in sort of what we call a critical consciousness awareness of how we can be change agents in any place that we end up in, right? In any career that you end up in. So my research is really what's called community engaged research, and community engaged scholarship and research includes scholarly activities and teaching too that is conducted in partnership with community-based agencies, organizations, whether that's local or international. So those pictures that are on this slide are really from us where we conduct one of our projects at a middle school in Santa Cruz. So that's our community partner in that case. But I've also am partnered with, for example, STARS, which is the transfer and reentry department in our university, and I conduct research with them, evaluate their programs, and really engage in trying to apply the research what we're learning about transfer students at UC Santa Cruz to programs that they're creating for transfer students at UC Santa Cruz. I've also conducted international research in Mexico with cultural organizations that serve indigenous populations in Yucatan. So all these different examples are really how I, as a researcher, my students as researchers, bring our skills, our tools, our research tools, but really engage in a co-partnership so we can use the research that we develop and that we co-create with our partner to implement a knowledge and change in their organizations. So I'm going to talk really briefly about past research project findings, and then I'm going to talk about what we're doing now in how we work in the lab, and then what we're doing now in the lab. So some of my work has focused on Indigenous Maya Mexican high school students. I've conducted quantitative and qualitative, what's called mixed method work, where I compared Indigenous Maya students that are in the diaspora or that are here in the United States to those that are still in Yucatan in Mexico in particular, and also to students that do not identify as Indigenous but are Mexican. And what I found in that study was that the boys, three groups: Indigenous, non-Indigenous, Indigenous in the United States, Indigenous in Mexico, had higher levels of discrimination, distress than girls, because I was trying to understand their experiences in school. So I used several scales regarding school belonging, as well as discrimination and stigmatization scales, social identity scales. And so I also found that ultimately at the intersection of being Indigenous and male, that those students were the ones that were getting the most frequent experiences with discrimination based on their race and based on their colorism. And so the other aspect of the study also showed that sort of mediating these experiences with discrimination was if family was supportive of their identity, in particular their ethno-racial identity, and also if the students were involved with cultural organizations. So that was one project. I also looked at immigrant origin young adults in community colleges, and again, in the same area, trying to understand their social identity development, and in particular, their experiences in community college. And so what we found, and part of the reason why we did this work was because adults go through community college first before they transfer to a four-year university. So it was really important for us to understand this first experience in higher education for immigrant origin young adults. And so what we found was they experienced a lot of microaggressions, in particular about their cultural and intersectional identities. So not only their ethno-racial identity, but also their identities as lower socioeconomic status. And in particular, we had hypothesized that they would experience that from peers, but they actually experienced it from instructors. And so we also wanted to understand, well, what happens when this occurs in the classrooms? Because we actually observed 65 community college classrooms. And we had people coding for interactions between peers and students, and interactions between students and instructors. And so we actually documented the responses of the students when this happens, when microaggressions occur from the instructor. And many times the students disengage, but we also documented resistance strategies, because part of our my goal in the research that I conduct is also not only to address the inequity and the stigma and the trauma that are empowered to resist those experiences as well. And so we looked at that and published from that. And then last, I've also conducted work on civic engagement, or the engaging in particular types of civic activities. So like traditional markers are like voting, but we find that Latinx young adults actually do other types of civic engagement at higher levels than non-Latinx young adults, and in particular than white young adults. And that includes volunteering in their community, translating for their families, mentoring, and being leaders in their either in their schools or in their community organizations that they're part of. And we also found that their motivation to engage in these civic activities and is related to a collective sense of social responsibility and a sense of social justice. And because all those projects were community engaged, so they were in partnership with the colleges, the cultural organizations for the indigenous Maya Mexican students, and also with organizations that were sort of or places where Latinx young adults engage in civic activities, we were able to take back all this research from those 3 projects to these communities. So for example, the research from the indigenous Maya Mexican high school students, they actually use the findings about the boys, right, the indigenous boys, to be able to get funding to create a consejos program. And this was actually in San Francisco in this community organization. And then I also used those findings to present professional development to schools that had a large majority of indigenous diasporic students in this area, in this local area, and in the LA area. And for the community college findings, we conducted workshops with the staff and the faculty and the educators. And then we also created spaces for the students to share more of their experiences and to engage in discussion, not only through you know, the observations and the interviews we had, but also through them just talking with each other and creating different sources of art. Like they created like videos, and they were in the process of creating different like pamphlets for immigrant origin community college students. And so we took back the research to them. And then lastly, for the civic engagement, we mentored some of the college students from an organization that partnered with us. In particular, we used some of this research to create a practice brief and a teach-in about undocumented student experiences, because we also found that undocumented students had more of these sort of motivations to engage civically. And so we created a website called Undocu Scholars. And so fast forward to what we're doing now, before I get into what the research that we're engaging in, I do want to talk a little bit about what it looks like to be, sorry about that, to be in the lab. Of course, we have our weekly meetings once a week as a group. So the lab is intergenerational, as I mentioned earlier. So that means at some points I have a postdoc, or so someone that already has their PhD that's working with me, collaborating on projects. I also have graduate students. So in that picture at a local park where there's 4 of us, those are the graduate students that are working with me, Valeria Alonso Blanco, Gloriana Lopez Leon, and sometimes other graduate students come in from other departments. So that third person is LALS, so Latin American and Latino Studies Department. And so they are sort of these project leads. And so we have, I have meetings with them as well, separately from our full lab meetings, and we discuss what we're going to do at our full lab meetings. They also have ad hoc meetings with the undergraduates. I have ad hoc meetings with the undergraduates if I'm a project lead. So for example, right now I'm a project lead for the Black Muslim World Making project that I'm going to talk about. Valeria is a project lead for the Youth Participatory Action Research project that I'm going to talk about. And her and I are both sort of co-leads for the transfer student project that I'm going to talk about. And every quarter, I also have one-on-one mentorship meetings with each of my undergraduates. And so there could range anywhere from like 10 to 15 undergrads in the lab. And they meet with me to talk about how the lab work is going, because lab life is a bit different from like your courses. And so we talk about whether, you know, they're feeling comfortable with the tasks that they're getting, with the professional development that we're giving them during our weekly meetings. And we also talk about their general experiences at UC Santa Cruz, and also their goals, their academic goals, their future do belonging activities. So like we'll decorate our lab door. So those are our doors in the department. And we'll have end of the year luncheon or picnic where we give them the graduating students their stoles with our lab logo, and just create a sense of community as well, because we all know that's really important in the research that we do. Okay. And so, like I mentioned, I'm going to briefly touch upon 4 different projects that we worked on and that we're continuing to work on. So I'm going to talk about the Black Muslim World Making Project, the Conexiones Culturales Youth Participatory Action Research Project, the Transfer Student of Color Receptivity Project, and the LGBTQ+ Digital and Campus Spaces Project. So as you'll notice across our projects, we use a framework called the Community Cultural Wealth Framework that some of you may be familiar with already. And we this framework is Dr. Tara Yoso's big contribution to education, to interdisciplinary work. It's rooted in critical race theory, and the community cultural wealth model is a strengths-based approach that acknowledges the cultural skills, cultural knowledge and abilities that students from minoritized backgrounds bring to their educational spaces. We use this model because it's important to sort of push back on more traditional models of social capital, which define social capital as relationships which can become social support and knowledge and skills that are related to school environments. And it usually is related to more so like your networking with like people that are empowered, basically. And so this framework pushes back in terms of what counts as capital. And so cultural capital really extends that definition, that traditional definition of social capital, and really highlights the assets that students' families have, that students learn from their families. So for example, linguistic capital, so being bilingual, familial capital, what you learn from your family, and in particular, it also highlights when you are a minoritized person, how you navigate spaces that may not be as welcoming to you. So those are like your aspirational capital, your navigational capital, and your resistant capital. And just for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into the specifics of that. But if you all have any questions about that, I can come back to it. So the Black Muslim World Making Project is an intersectional It looks at the intersectional lived experiences of Black Muslim college students. And I started this project with a colleague of mine that is at Arizona State University, Dr. Kia McGuire, who's a faculty in higher education. I also work with a lot of non-psychologists on my projects because, again, I am very interdisciplinary. And so we use a mix of critical race psychology, which is, and critical race theory, which basically centers on how race and racism impact social institutions to sustain racial inequalities. Critical race psychology in particular looks at understanding this within the aspects of how we interact, how institutions create inequities, in particular in our social interactions, and also in particular to push back on traditional ways that social psychology has looked at race and ethnicity and move beyond just it being a variable and really centering on the lived experiences of minoritized people that are racially minoritized and that are impacted by institutional racism. And so in our project, we did participatory research, which means that we involved the participants not only in, like, for example, just conducting a survey, we actually involved them in different types of participatory research methods, one of which is photo voice, where we asked them to take pictures of their lived experiences as college students in across different areas or campuses, across different campuses in Arizona State University, here at UC Santa Cruz. And this is one of our participants, Naruru Hassan, and she participated in a project out of the other students that we interviewed called a testimonial, and she co-produced her own testimonial with us, and ultimately was the first author on a paper with myself and Dr. McGuire, because we also try to disrupt what we think of how we share knowledge and how we disseminate knowledge. So participants take center stage in how we disseminate that knowledge. And so the testimonial was very much collaborative with her, and it really focused on her experiences as a refugee Muslim person and a woman, and how those entangled marginalities were confronted on a day-to-day basis. In particular, she the identity with her Blackness as a point that shows a constant negotiation with other identities that may not be as visible. And in particular, we also talked about exosystemic experiences that directly related to her lived experiences, which included anti-immigrant and racist policies that directly affected her experiences with, like, for example, being separated from her father because he was unable to be here in the United States due to different bans on refugees and asylees. And so the testimonial provided a space for reflection and collective and intentional subtle practices of resistance. Let's see. And so we're expanding that project right now. And so we're trying to understand, basically conducting a very similar process where we conduct a pre-interview questionnaire, then the students do an interview with us, and then they engage in photo voice for 2 weeks. So again, taking pictures of their experiences on campus, and then they do a focus group interview with us. And so right now I have 3 students working with myself, Dr. McGuire, and another collaborator now, Dr. Samiha Rahman, on these experiences of Black Muslim students. So I see the time, so I'm going to move on a little bit quick. And youth participatory action research centers on youth as people that are experts on their own experiences. So they participate in training to conduct their own research projects. And we, as the researchers, engage in that training with them, but also conduct research. It's sort of meta on how this experience with them learning about research impacts their experiences in their schooling and with their families, with their community. And ultimately the youth conduct research and then create an action from that research findings that they have. And so we in particular are looking at immigrant origin students, and most of them are Latine, and we want to understand how they conceptualize their experiences with anti-immigrant policies, also how their youth participatory action research relates to their resilience and their sense of belonging, and also to their familial and community cultural wealth. So we developed a program at a local middle school called Conexiones Culturales, and we have about 10, give or take, students at a time that engage with us weekly. We just finished last week and then sharing it with their school or with their parents or with their community. And so on this project, we have undergraduates that go to the school with us on a weekly basis to engage in mentorship of the students, but also to engage in research, in teaching them how to do research, and also in research themselves. So some of the students conduct ethnographic field notes in the classroom, others conduct interviews with the students, and we also give them a survey. And so in particular, we've started to write on several aspects of this project. One of them is really understanding how the students are fostering belonging through this program and how they're resisting particular discriminatory experiences that they've shared with us. And, oops, sorry about that. And so we actually were able to analyze some of the interview data from our youth, and we found, so we did qualitative analysis, and so we found ways that they build their relationships and maintain their relationships through the program with their peers, but also in really also having a space where they can talk about their cultural similarities, but also the cultural mismatch that they experience at the school. The school where they're at is primarily, they're the minority. There's not a lot of immigrant students, and there's not a lot of Latina students there. They also talk about their experiences with the program in terms of wanting to go to college. So one of the students said, a lot of people say, oh, you don't have to go to college to be successful. And I start believing them. And so when I got into this YPAR program, it kind of is teaching me that college students can be successful in life. Another student talked about being more focused on in school now that they're part of this program, and really feeling like excited about school and learning about their culture, like even playing loteria. Another aspect of the project that we're looking at is we also interviewed the parents of the students. So we, and the parents were all the mothers. And so we conducted another thematic analysis with the interviews from the mothers. And we found how they build their relationships with their students, how they've seen a change in their students from the program, where they're more willing to talk to their students about their own knowledge and skills or values from their culture, or their saberes y conocimientos, knowledges and knowings. And they also see that really speak in Spanish to the students, and also translate. We're bilingual. And so the mothers also talked about how they have these, and the students talked about how they are valuing the skills that the students are learning and practicing their Spanish and continuing their linguistic capital, for example. But the mothers also talked about not only the relationships they're building with their own students, but also with the other parents in the program. And they also talked about the experiences they've had in general in the educational spaces, where they feel like they're not validated in terms of their culture. Some of them feel like they're neglected by the school because of their language differences. And so they really talked also about their those experiences, but yet they still know that they're really wanting to connect more with the other parents that are part of this program. They know that the students benefit from the program as well, and that they want to make sure that the program continues in the school. So I'm just going to move really quickly now. The other project that I said I'd talk about a little bit more is the transfer. We are partnered with STARS to look at how campus practices and attitudes impact Latinx and also other transfer students of color and their sense of belonging to an HSI, to our HSI, and then the role of relationships and community cultural wealth on the experiences of the transfer students of color. And so we use this framework called transfer receptive culture that focuses on students as on transfer students as a high institutional priority, and really focuses on understanding their pre-transfer and their transfer experience, and that trying to gauge how the institution is acknowledging their lived experiences, their intersections, and creating particular programs, but also assessments to understand whether or not our school is a transfer hotspot or has high transfer receptivity. And so I'm not going to go into the details of the methods because I do want to share what we've been finding more importantly. So this was a mixed method study. So we collected both surveys of about 268 students and also focus groups with 20 of the students. And so we found that in terms of relationships, actually mediate the relationship between the social identity threat that our transfer students of color feel, meaning the threat they feel because they are minoritized students, so the stigma that they feel. Faculty relationships and peer relationships make that less impactful to their sense of belonging. And then we also found that faculty relationships and peer relationships make it less impactful for them to feel like this perceived prejudice because of their transfer status, impacting their sense of belonging. So that's what you see in those images of the mediations. The focus groups really actually, so the qualitative piece, we actually created this infographic that's being used by the university with the qualitative piece where we found different themes that we found a theme called relationships for transfer receptivity, which aligns with the quantitative findings. So the students say they're very grateful to have found friends at UC Santa Cruz, and most importantly, same similarities that they came from community college, and they help each other to overcome the challenges that they have here in the new system at UC Santa Cruz. And they also talked about structures that create isolating experiences. That was another theme that came up. So sometimes they feel unwelcoming spaces in the university, make them feel isolated and like imposters. There's also this idea of a transfer receptive paradox where transfer students must navigate these assumptions that people have of each other, of them, that are very contradictory, meaning sometimes people think they know everything about being in college because they assume they've been here since they were freshmen. But then other times when they find that certain university communities find that because they're transfer students, they know less or they're not as well prepared. So that's the paradox, right? Knowing too much, but they don't because they haven't been here as long, but then assuming that they know too little in terms of content. And then there's institutional incongruence of diversity initiatives. The students in the focus groups talked about this mismatch between the campus stated commitment to diversity and inclusivity and the actual enactment of diverse initiatives. And so they also talk about their cultural knowledge and strengths. So we found that navigational and aspirational capital were really strong in both the quantitative findings and also the qualitative focus groups. And we made some recommendations for the university as well. So lastly, the little time that I have left, I'm going to talk about this last project that's being led by one of my students, Gloriana, my doctoral student, Gloriana Lopez Leon. as sites or settings where marginalized individuals challenge dehumanizing mainstream narratives to promote positive self-concepts, resist oppression, and collectively reimagine their identities. And so she collected about, right now we have about 10 interviews with Latina LGBTQ young adults, and we asked them about their experiences online and also on campus spaces. So one of the publications that she has out right now is looked specifically at the intersection of oppression based gendered racism, gendered colorism, and racist heterosexism with one particular student. So we did a case study with this student. And in particular, we found that a lot of the ways that the student uses social media is really to engage in this identity work through narratives where they find different they learn about identities that they may not be able to talk about with their families or with their peers, in particular their gender and sexuality in these online spaces. And so these are the counter spaces where they're able to be fully seen and understood. And they also find space platforms where they also learn about being at this intersection of Latina and part of the LGBTQ community. And so these intersectional counter spaces are actually creating a sense of critical consciousness in this particular individual. And so we're expanding this project to an ethnography of TikTok in particular. And Gloriana's questions are, how do Latinx LGBTQ people use TikTok to resist intersectional marginalization, and what features of TikTok are conductive to counterspace construction among these individuals? And so lastly, I know, I wanted to share a couple like insights or testimonials from our own undergraduate researchers and their experiences in the lab. Sidra, who is pictured below, doing her own independent research presentation through a Pathways to Research opportunity, said, when I found Miel, I was most surprised at how much it emphasizes reciprocity and support. The lab was there to serve as a resource for me as much as it is a lab. Being in Miel shaped my experience at UC Santa Cruz. I learned to conduct research and to get I need from my mentors, including career development or graduate school preparation. It's an amazing environment. I didn't feel like my progress in research was rushed, but rather cultivated and supported by everyone in the MEM team. And I will move to the next slide. Amir, who's now an alum of UC Santa Cruz and is pictured sharing a poster at the Society for Research and Child Development meeting, talks about the being enlightened by how Miel focused on building community to foster cultural strengths. His experience with the Youth Participatory Action Research Project highlights this cultural strength perspective, and he learned through more about the students' needs through lived experiences and daily interactions, and had much richer understanding of the transformative change through qualitative research that can really remind him of the lived experiences when conducting quantitative research. And there's a couple more testimonials from different students that are, again, connecting their own research. Some of these pictures are of our students that recently presented at their Building Belonging talks as well to share their research. And so I am done. And here's, if you would like more information about the lab, you can scan the QR code in this, both QR codes. One is for the lab application and the other one is for our Instagram account. And I want to thank you all, but I also really want to thank my current and past undergraduate researchers, because they've really gotten, moved a lot of the research projects forward, but also provided a perspective that's critical and that's always pushing me to think outside of our traditional silos of psychology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Casanova. And I'm just gonna share my screen for the rest of the presentation. Okay. So now we will be opening it up to every one of you for any questions for Professor Casanova. Feel free to raise your hands or type them in the chat. And we have some questions here from our peer advisors, just to open it up. Professor Casanova, can you tell us a little bit more on what drew you to specialize in researching the diverse learning experiences of immigrant origin students and students of color?
An immigrant person, as a person that's faced various experiences with my family and my community, that when I went to college, I started to critically think about, and I was fortunate enough to find a mentor in Dr. Padilla and other people in social psychology, like Dr. Hazel Marcus, who really mentored me and really like believed in me too, that like the questions that I had that I thought were just, everyday questions could be research questions that we could study from a social psychological or educational perspective. And that's really what till this day drives my research and how I interact. I think I very much model after my own mentors in terms of how I mentor the students that I have in my classes, and also obviously in the MIA in our lab.
Okay.
Thank you. And another question we had is, what is a piece of advice for someone who is unsure if they are qualified to apply for research?
Just really consider that there's a lot of different tools that you can gain from being in a research lab, and really use that as a motivation to apply, to connect with faculty. If you have a class that you're really engaged in and that you're like really wanting to understand more of the details of what you're learning from that class, meet with the professor during office hours and ask them, about their research, and start from there. I don't think, doubt will be there, but I don't think it's something that should prevent you from taking advantage of these opportunities. Like I said, there's many undergraduates that are at universities where they're not research one universities, or there's very little research that's being done at those institutions. So you all have a very you're very fortunate to have a lot of research being conducted by faculty, by graduate students that are in the psychology department and other units that you could form part of. And maybe I will also say, if you're a little bit doubtful in terms of like approaching a faculty member, maybe start with a graduate student. I've that they've met with, because the undergrads have expressed interest in similar research areas that I'm engaging in the lab. And so sometimes graduate students are a great bridge to the research labs as well.
And then just a reminder to the attendees that are on right now, if you're interested in starting or furthering your journey in research, the psychology department posts opportunities online.
as well as on our bulletin board outside of the advising office on the second floor of social sciences too.
Okay, I don't think there's any more questions, but we want to thank Professor Casanova again for the insight that you've shared so far with us. Hopefully, all of the people in here have a better idea of what to expect out of research and can even see themselves as future researchers. I hope everyone has a good day. Thank you so much.